Hello, everyone. In this section, I would like to talk about psychoactive drugs. So, psychoactive drugs are those that alter brain function. And basically, throughout history, people have discovered ways that taking or consuming a substance can alter your mental state. So, the psychoactive drugs are mind altering substances that change your brain's neurochemistry and activate the neurotransmitter systems, either by stimulating them or inhibiting them. And so we have to remember that when we're talking about drugs, that there's many things that kind of fall under this. This includes medications that have medicinal uses, but then also other types of substances that can potentially lead to substance abuse. So, one class of these drugs are stimulants, and these increase your nervous system activity in both mental and physical processes. Usually, stimulants in some way interfere with the reuptake of dopamine, sometimes norepinephrine as well. An example of this would be, say, like cocaine, which blocks the reuptake of dopamine. And this can cause an increase in confidence and alertness and sociability. You also have things like methamphetamine, which blocks the reuptake of dopamine, but can have some really damaging effects, say, on like the frontal lobes of the brain. Another class of drugs are the depressants. And so these are kind of the opposite. They decrease nervous system activity and in mental and physical processes. In large doses, depressants can cause sleep and sometimes even death. But because of this sleepiness, we often call them sedatives. Um, you have to be very careful because some of these will suppress breathing as well, and that's where they can lead to death or coma or death. Um, Depressants usually activate GABA receptors, and GABA being that inhibitory neuromolecule. Alcohol is the most widely used depressant. Um, and one thing you have to be careful about excessive alcohol use is that can lead to something known as Korsakoff syndrome, which is characterized by these really profound memory problems and cognitive issues as well. But also, other types of depressants include things like benzodiazepines and barbiturates. Another form of our class of drugs are the opiates. And so these are drugs that reduce pain and usually produce a pleasurable feeling. And they do this by binding with opioid receptors. So you do have these endogenous opioid receptors that can help your body deal with pain. And so these opiates then um, utilize those same receptors in the brain. Opiates can include drugs such as heroin or morphine or oxycodone, codeine, fentanyl. Um, and so these drugs provide a lot of reward value. And even within the absence of a high that's kind of associated with something like a stimulant or something that might give you this euphoria from getting the drug, this can work through just simply removing pain. People become addicted because these drugs remove their pain. And then you get to where you can't cope with pain, or possibly get to where you can't cope with pain just using your own endogenous neurochemicals. You can become dependent on the exogenous drug or that you feel this kind of extreme pain. Another class of drugs are the hallucinogens. And these are drugs that cause effects on perceptual experiences and can cause sensory images, even if there isn't, um, sensory input coming in. Examples of this include things like ecstasy or LSD or taking mushrooms or peyote. And these work by activating certain types of serotonin receptors. Then you also have drugs like ketamine and PCP, which work through glutamate receptors. Um, Traditionally, marijuana had been classified as a hallucinogen, but it's really not a good description. While there can be some hallucinogens that occur through this, um, it really doesn't neatly fit into any kind of the traditional drug categories particularly well. Marijuana works through this active ingredient of THC, which binds to cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So people can experience substance use disorders where you have a compulsive craving to use the drug and can cause negative consequences. You could talk about an addiction to caffeine, and while it meets some of the criteria of a substance use disorder, rarely are there kind of negative consequences for drinking a lot of cups of coffee. Um, so there's there's kind of more that kind of goes into defining when something is a substance use disorder. Often we'll have physical and psychological dependence. Physical dependence are where we have either exhibits tolerance or withdrawal. So, tolerance is when you need to take higher and higher doses of a drug in order to receive the same effect. Withdrawal is when, if you stop using the drug, that you usually experience the opposite effects of whatever the drug was. So, if a drug was pain relieving, you become hypersensitive to pain. If the drug made you sleepy, then you experience insomnia where you can't fall asleep. So usually they're kind of this opposite, but withdrawal is usually a very negative feeling. Now, this in itself doesn't mean that a drug is addictive. Once again, you can think about this with caffeine. People build up a tolerance to caffeine where they could drink multiple cups of coffee and it not have much waking effect. Or if they go without their morning coffee, they have a headache. Caffeine relieves headache. So a withdrawal sign would be that you have a headache. They feel sluggish and lethargic, which would be the opposite of the stimulating effects of caffeine. Um, my allergy medication. I've had lifelong allergies, and I've had to go through several different ones because I'll build up a tolerance where it'll no longer really affect um, uh, my allergies. And if I forget to take a pill in the morning, my nose will itch and I will sneeze that day. I'll have a withdrawal effect from that. So, physical dependence is something that can occur with many types of drugs. On the other hand, if you have something like powder cocaine, it doesn't really have much physical dependence. There isn't much tolerance or withdrawal associated with it. But few people would argue that cocaine is not an addictive substance. So, how can something like cocaine be addictive if doesn't cause physical dependence? Well, there's also psychological dependence. And this can depend on positive and negative reinforcement. And later this semester, we're going to go into this in a lot more detail. But basically, positive reinforcement is when you receive a positive stimulus that makes you want to do the behavior more. And so drugs can produce pleasurable states. And that can lead to a person wanting to get high or whatever again. And so that is a reason that a person will want to use a drug again. You also can have negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is when you remove something that's negative that makes a person want to do something more. So much like where we talked about the opiates, you can have drugs that remove pain, and a person will want to continue taking the drug to take the pain away. But also with many drugs that have withdrawal, if you are going through withdrawal from a drug, the best way to get rid of withdrawal is to take the drug again. And so, so people are motivated to continue using the drug in order to avoid the negative consequences of withdrawal. Now, there's many factors that go into drug use. Um, Most people will experience a drug but never move on to problematic use. And so a person can initially experiment with a drug and never use it again. Some people will then move into a non problematic use where something is just used occasionally. But some of those then will move into where they have a substance abuse problem, and they then create a substance dependence. And this can go through cycles where there might be periods of time where they stop using or then move back to a much less non-problematic way of using, and then maybe abuse again. And so there is no kind of one pathway that a person has toward drug use, and it can be very individualized. But that also means things like the gateway theory of drugs using doesn't really actually work, because that assumes that everyone has this kind of single pathway. You start smoking, and then you drink, and then you're using marijuana, and then you're using heroin, and that's not really true. I mean, on average, you might see that kind of pattern, but that's mainly because children have a lot easier alcohol to cigarettes and alcohol than they do to something like heroin, or methamphetamines, which would require teenagers to be able to drive and go into, find a drug dealer and whatnot. Um, so, but most people who do things like drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes do not turn into people who use heroin or methamphetamines or these other types of drugs. And patterns can be all over the place. There is no one set pattern for how people use drugs. So be very careful about people who kind of preach that one thing necessarily leads to another. This is a very individualized thing, and different people have different experiences with using different substances.